South America, Chile, Argentina, all the way to the Americas. So in the Western Hemisphere. So I remember during these 2010, during the rise of the uprisings in North Africa and the Middle East, it was Passover. It was the eve of Passover, and there was a university meeting on the meaning of freedom as Passover was approaching. It was held in the Jewish community, the Slipka Center at Yale. And leading scholars, there were about 50 people around a large square table like this, with PhD students on the outside and all these professors on the inside, and everybody was speaking about the Arab Spring. And there was a resolution passed that everybody who was celebrating the Passover Seder should set a chair aside for the people struggling for democracy in the Middle East. And everybody was watching Al Jazeera TV, which we now know is funded by the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And in those days, it was the television station that all the scholars were running home to watch the uprising. And the uprising was fascinating television because you had all these anchors and reporters running through the square in Cairo, and these anchors are usually sort of models, all right? They're kind of good-looking people running through the crowds. And there were fireworks and hundreds of thousands of people chanting, and Anderson Cooper's running with his hoodie, and it was all very exciting. But the context, what was happening, and I remember everybody was around the table saying how this is wonderful, and democracy is coming to the Middle East, and this is an amazing thing. And this was the position of the American administration, the American government, and many Western countries were seeing this as something positive. And I remember I mentioned that, if you look at the crowds in Cairo, the vast majority of these people are illiterate, and the slogans that people were saying were Islamist slogans. They were not about democracy, they were Islamist slogans. So when a large group, a crowd, unfortunately highly illiterate group of people for the most part, because the democratic, educated elite who were at the forefront for a moment were kind of marginalized in this process. And I brought to the attention of this group that there's Islamist slogans, and what does this mean for democracy, and what does this mean for religious minorities in Egypt, what does this mean for moderates, and at this point, sort of the bloggers, the progressive elite in the cities were being pushed aside by the Brotherhood, and what does this mean for democracy? And what is the Arab Spring? And at this point, this question brought a very angry reaction, because what does this mean? And of course I spoke also about anti-Semitism in the region. And now we know that the Arab Spring is something that I would call the Islamic winter. And the upheaval that this this short period of history brought is still with us and ongoing, and the failing states in the region poses an issue for all of us concerned about democracy, human rights, anti-Semitism, and human respect. So I want to start by speaking about globalization. And I would argue that most of the scholarship on anti-Semitism, and it's interesting because anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, which is not a part of the academy, it's not a part of the courses, and it should be. But unlike, I would argue, gender studies, unlike studies on racism and race relations, that the study of anti-Semitism has been left off the academy. In some circles, in multicultural discourse circles, Jews in Europe have suddenly become white and not a part of the multicultural race relations studies. In some societies, the demography of Jews are not being kept for all sorts of reasons. They're not part of censuses and that sort of thing. So the identities of Jews in Europe were perceived as non-white, poisoning the Aryan race, and suddenly, in a short period of time, in other countries, other places, Jews became white, which is an interesting process. So not part of the discourse on racism and discrimination. And a lot of the research, I would argue, is descriptive in nature and doesn't have the same rigor that race relations and gender studies and feminist studies and anti-racism studies has. And I think that there has been, of course, there's many issues in our society on feminist questions and racist questions, but there has been advances in scholarship on these issues, and I think those of us who do cultural studies or social sciences get some understanding of issues of race and gender. So there is progress, but the issue of anti-Semitism has been left off the mark. And what I want to speak, I think, in terms of trying to create a situation where we're not doing descriptive analysis, but more rigorous structural analysis of society, that we need to look at processes of globalization. And so there's a difference between global anti-Semitism and globalization and anti-Semitism. And I would argue, from my perspective, that we should look at globalization and anti-Semitism. And the thing about ISGAP, by the way, is that our scholars have all sorts of different perspectives, and everybody is welcome. So I have colleagues who are very involved in ISGAP, who think my perspective is appropriate, and some are critical, and that's fine. So in my approach, I try to look at this issue in a more analytical way and look at socioeconomic, political, cultural, and the ideological impact of globalization. I think few scholars contextualize their studies of anti-Semitism in this manner, and there's a need to combine empirical and conceptual analysis of anti-Semitism within an interdisciplinary framework. The contemporary condition, which is characterized by the crisis of modernity, the process of globalization, which are governed by a neoliberal approach, the weakening of the state, the emergence of radical political Islam as an effective social movement, the reluctance of the Western intellectuals to critically engage these processes, and the reemergence for the first time since the Holocaust of a deadly form of anti-Semitism, I would argue vigorously requires the development of a creative, interdisciplinary, critical approach within a cooperative research entity to begin to assess this phenomenon in a serious ways. So to look at globalization, and I think globalization has a direct bearing on anti-Semitism, and in the last several decades, nationalism, new forms of identity and politics have exacerbated social, economic, and political cleavages, causing the emergence of a crisis in the extension of the global competitive markets and the effect of structural adjustment, and the intensification of socioeconomic inequalities, the blurring of international and domestic politics and conflicts, and a worldwide escalation of adversarial identity politics. So in other words, globalization and neoliberalism starts, I would argue, with structural adjustment with Reagan and Thatcher, and the structural adjustment that the G7 forced upon developing countries. People thought that neoliberalism and the extension of global economic and competitive markets, allowing market forces to intervene and expand into societies, would create more development and bring about more democracy. So there was a push by neoliberals, by the G7, to force governments to open their markets to capital forces and to limit the intervention of the state. So on issues of healthcare, education, welfare, the states were forced to become smaller, to shrink, and not to intervene as directly as before. So we had, in advanced capitalist countries like Canada, education. I went to McGill for, I think it was about $250 a year, compared to the free market system of an Ivy League education in the United States, in those days probably $40,000, because education and healthcare in social democratic countries were perceived as human rights, and the state intervened in the economy to ensure that all citizens had access to these human rights, to these resources. As and in third world or developing countries, the intervention of the state was lower. So in places like Egypt, it wasn't university education necessarily, but basic health care, primary education, food subsidies of sugar and of flour and that sort of thing the state provided. And in this sort of state system, there was the promise of modernity and development. So even though situations were difficult in developing countries, there was the promise of integrating citizens into a future growing and developing society. With the structural adjustment and neoliberalism and this belief that free markets were going to bring about economic growth and further development of democratic principles, we see this sort of movement resulting ultimately, and if you look at the UNDP reports and other indicators, we see on the one hand globalization bringing people together as never before. The fact that we can sit in a room like this and travel and communicate with technology, with Skype, with interface, with Facebook, and you know, we travel, we probably eat the same kind of foods, we have access to the same types of food and fashion, and we consume similar things from education to culture to whatever. This is what sort of middle-class global intellectuals and scholars do. So we are coming together as never before. Investment, economic investment now with the stroke of a key on a computer. You can move billions of dollars from one market to the other market in a flash of a second. And on the other hand, we come together, and at the same time there's marginalization and levels of disenfranchisement as never before. What's also, so globalization in a sense is bringing together people together as never before and separating people in significant manners. So, and both processes or both aspects are the result of the processes of neoliberal globalization. They're both similar. And I would argue what's fascinating about globalization and neoliberalism is, on the one hand, neoliberals argue that if the state gets out of the economy, there'll be more economic development. And the Islamists, for example, reactionary forces, and actually nationalist forces now re-emerging in Europe and in other places, are arguing from an Islamist perspective, political Islamist perspective, that the state is a foreign entity, it's part of colonialism and imperialism and needs to be destroyed. So we have two major forces creating a vacuum in societies. On the one hand, neoliberal Western capitalism. On the other hand, the reactionary sort of social forces that are now, as we see, filling a vacuum in society, replacing the state and providing education, basic forms of healthcare and welfare, providing education in the mosque, etc., etc. So we see in the last several decades, with the rise of neoliberalism and globalization, we also see the emergence or the re-emergence and the empowering of reactionary social forces in many societies, and that the weight of structural adjustment, the weight of the processes of globalization is actually causing many societies or many countries and states to fail. So there's failing states, Syria, Iraq, Sudan. States are actually crumbling in the society, and you can make the argument that these processes are playing out to the point where you can make an argument that Syria and Iraq don't even exist anymore, and maps are being redrawn in such a profound way that our sort of perception of the world, of what constitutes borders and boundaries in society, are not keeping up with the pace of the reality of the change on the ground. So we're, I would argue, through the process of globalization, entering into this very revolutionary moment in history. And this moment is causing all sorts of dislocation. In the work of David Harvey and other people that do work on globalization, they use this notion of time-space compression. I think it's very important in terms of understanding globalization. So time-space compression notes that in a globalized world, the more time and space that you can occupy, the more you're on the imposing, if you will, end of globalization. The less time and space that you can cover, you're on the receiving end of globalization. So in other words, what means globalization for us is more international contacts, travel, integration in the economy, access to certain consumer goods and products, etc., etc. That means that we're on the implementing side of globalization, more or less, not like some of the major equity fund managers that move billions of dollars around in a flash. But we're sort of somewhere in the middle. And those of us who are stuck in time and space are on the receiving end of globalization. So people living in townships and shanty towns, in inner cities in the United States, people who don't have the capacity to move around or to have access to jobs, to access to consumer goods, from basic levels of nutrition to other forms of consumer goods. They're on the fixed end of globalization. I think this is a very important concept to understand levels of marginality and integration in society. So some social groups initiate the flows of movement of capital, while others do not. Some are on the receiving end of it. So globalization ultimately divides as much as it unites. And it's in this sort of level of marginalization and dislocation that I would argue that the reemergence of anti-Semitism, the Jew as the scapegoat, plays an important role, especially when, on the one hand, as we were saying earlier, we are intellectually handcuffed to deal with these issues for all sorts of reasons, our colonial, racist, imperial past. We don't want to repeat the problems of the colonial era or World War II or the Holocaust, so we're apprehensive to judge certain things. And on the other hand, the rise of radical political Islam, which is using European Nazi forms of anti-Semitism as we speak. And I think what's very important to realize is that anti-Semitism is a European phenomenon that has been imported into the Islamic world. And you can make the argument, as Bassam Tibi does, that there was discrimination against Jews. There's a whole legacy of Jews being second-class or protected minorities. So they weren't equal citizens under Islamic law at any time. But there wasn't a form of anti-Semitism. So yes, discrimination, but not this genocidal form of anti-Semitism, which is, I think, European. But through colonialism, through missionary works, through nationalism, through the Nazis and the emergence of nation states towards the end of the colonial period, there's this strong connection to European fascism and Nazism being exported and used in the Middle East. And you can see this in a lot of flags in the region, and it's prevalent. And the Muslim Brotherhood taking this, sort of amalgamating a very narrow form of Islam with European anti-Semitism and Nazism. So there are 3 points that I think we need to consider. One, the failure to recognize anti-Semitism studies as a valid academic discipline actually contributes to the ongoing mode of apologetic lethargy concerning the long-lasting prejudice. No more than ever is there a need for a vibrant, critical, open, interdisciplinary research project, if you will, to develop curriculum, to develop research, a body of research on these issues, and to affect policy. The failure of academia to assert its independence from funding sources and government failure to influence the study of human rights and efforts to combat hatred is also a failure worthy of research in and of itself, and I'll speak to this in a moment. And that anti-Semitism is an important issue in the study of globalization, modernity, and postmodernity, and needs to be on the map. Islamic studies, this is just one example of the mess we're in. Islamic studies was created at Oxford University roughly, I think, 15 years ago. Phyllis will know more than that in terms of the exact date.
25 years ago.
25 years ago. Amazingly, on the first board of trustees, the people who were on the forefront of creating Islamic studies at Oxford University, the first board of trustees consisted of Sheikh Kawadari. Does anybody know who Sheikh Kawadari is?
Yeah.
Okay, Sheikh Kawadari. Yusuf Kawadari. On the board of trustees, the first board of trustees of Islamic studies, that was well funded by the Muslim Brotherhood here at Oxford. So Sheikh Kawadari, sorry for my pardon?
Supreme leader.
Supreme leader, yeah. So sorry for my Anglo pronunciation of his name. So Sheikh Kawadari is the supreme leader, the chief rabbi of the Muslim Brotherhood, who literally, I'm speaking literally now, you can quote me on this, who literally encouraged his believers to finish the work of Hitler. Literally. He calls on all believers to finish the work of Hitler. not only to annihilate the state of Israel, the Zionist entity, but to kill Jews everywhere, wherever they are. And this is the Board of Trustees, the founding Board of Trustees of Islamic Studies at one of the finest universities in the world, and with 900 years of history.
How about the head of Islamic Studies right now?
And the head of this
Tariq Ramadan, who is the grandchild of Hassan al-Banna, who founded the Muslim Brotherhood.
yeah.
He's the head of Islamic Studies right now, St. Anthony's.
Right, right.
And also the chair of the Board of Trustees, the founding chair of the Board of Trustees, Maulana Abul Hassan Ali Nadwi. He was a person who translated Maududi from Urdu into Arabic, and his own writings are full of anti-Semitic rhetoric.
So here we go. This is all very important. These are things that need to be understood. But I think the basic point, and we can talk about Islamic studies at Oxford for 2 weeks. Literally. No, literally. And to evaluate who these actors are, how the funding came here, and to examine the research that these scholars are perpetuating. This scholarship of genocidal anti-Semitism. So how is it possible that a university like Oxford would actually even think of accepting money from an individual or a social movement that, given the legacy of anti-Semitism in Europe, would actually accept funds and allow the participation in a university, what a university is supposed to be, as we heard last night, to play a major role in not only participating in a university like Oxford, but being at the forefront of Islamic studies around the world. And this is where, we're actually doing at ISGAP a project of looking at the funding of American universities by Islamists, which is a whole other story which I won't have the opportunity to get into here. But in a sense, we in the West have been aiding and abetting the rise of this reactionary social movement, appeasing them, using them, etc., for sort of mutual benefit. But the results of the genocide in Syria, the result of terrorism in the streets of Europe, and the fact that generations of young scholars at the best universities in the Western world are not only learning to be acquiescent to the rise of anti-Semitism, they're actually becoming schooled in hate. They are becoming schooled in hate. Pay $70,000 at an Ivy League university in the United States, Georgetown, Yale, Harvard, Oxbridge, the Sorbonne, and the finest universities in the world have this excuse of Islamic studies, or a dominant form of Islamic studies that is being perpetuated in the university system. So at one level, it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise that we are in this sort of horrific quagmire internationally and globally, because for 2 generations, we have willfully, for short-term gain, turned a blind eye to the impact and influence of funding from the Muslim Brotherhood and other reactionary forces in the Middle East that are buying the institutions that are safeguarding, that should be safeguarding and developing democratic principles in education, namely universities, the media of record, and other cultural institutions that are being bought by these reactionary forces, and we are willfully participating in their sale. And this poses a major threat, I'm arguing, to democratic principles, to notion of equality, to notions of citizenship, and that all of us should be equal under one legal system. When our educational institutes are being affected at this level, it's really cause for concern. But it's because of anti-Semitism that we allow it to happen. Because we're also learning for 2 generations that Israel is an apartheid, fascist, racist society, and what befalls the Israelis, they deserve. Right? So this is part of our education. And I think this is, as we see, a detriment not only to all of us, but certainly it's a crisis in the Middle East, and this crisis in a globalized world knows very little boundaries, and it's beginning to affect us slightly. I just as an antidote, I was walking down the street last night, or Saturday night in Oxford, and I remember when I came here in the 1980s, the bobbies, the policemen, had no guns, they had a billy stick. And then in the mid-80s, late 80s, there was a very controversial move where the police had squad cars, police cars on a back street away from public view, where there'd be police officers that were armed in the car with pistols in case there was some sort of crisis. And the other night, walking down the Oxford City Police, I never seen this in my life, were walking with armored protection and 2 submachine guns, doing two soldiers, 2 Oxford police officers walking in a pair with submachine guns, armed and vigilant. And this is a sign of the times that we're living in. So I think, without going into too much more detail on globalization, because I really want to speak to this quickly, this should form the context of our analysis, that we should do, I think, less descriptive analysis and more structural, interdisciplinary work, conceptual work on situating anti-Semitism in the processes of globalization and the processes in which our societies are being profoundly affected. So, anti-Judaism is a complex and at times perplexing form of hatred. And the term anti-Semitism was coined in the 1870s by Wilhelm Marr, different perspective than Akiva, and it's also a controversial and at times confusing term. Yet, despite its etymological limitations and contradictions, I would argue that it remains a valid and useful term. The term specifically refers to prejudice and discrimination against the Jewish people. Some, incorrectly and for reasons of political expediency, use the term to refer to prejudice against all so-called Semitic peoples, claiming Arab people cannot be anti-Semitic because they are Semitic themselves. So this sort of issue. So this is the point. Anti-Semitism refers to a specific form of hatred that is mainly European in origin and focuses on the Jewish people. Scholars prefer to use the term anti-Semitism without the hyphen or uncapitalized, since it refers to a form of hatred or a phenomenon rather than a specific race or biologically determined group. Emil Frankenheim, for example, used the unhyphened form for this reason. So some scholars who have examined the complexities of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitism claim that it takes several forms, including socio-economic, political, cultural, and religious anti-Semitism. René Koenig, for example, contend that these different forms of anti-Semitism demonstrate that the origins of anti-Semitism are actually rooted in different historical periods and places. So, as I was saying last night, when religion, in particular Christianity, represented the dominant way to perceive reality, the Jews were regarded as the followers of the wrong religion. It was also believed that their refusal to accept the Christian notion of the Messiah disqualified them from any form of redemption, and that the Jewish stubbornness hindered world redemption. Finally, it was hardly necessary to recall that Jews were accused of deicide, the killing of Christ, or the dominant manner in which Europeans perceive, so they were accused of deicide, of killing Christ. And this anti-Semitic trope played a very important role in justifying and legitimizing anti-Semitism, and plays a role in the Holocaust and pogroms, and goes back for many centuries. When the dominant form, or the dominant manner in which Europeans perceived reality was based on the notion of race, and biologically determined notions of identity, of ethnicity and race, the Jews were constructed as belonging to another inferior race. According to the Nazis and other nationalists who subscribed to these racist beliefs, they were perceived as polluting the white and Aryan race and needed to be removed in order to safeguard the purity of the race and of the nation. So again, we see the genocidal element inherent in anti-Semitism. Currently, some would argue, for various reasons, the self-determination of the Jews, the non-Muslim other, on so-called Islamic land, is a sin and should not be tolerated. So Israel, for example, or Israel, is the only state that's other, that's non-Muslim in the Islamic world, in the Islamic region. So Israel, the self-determination of the Jews, is the only other space where Muslims do not dominate. There is a democracy in which the notion of citizenship exists. So this, from an Islamist perspective, cannot be tolerated. So others in the West see the Jewish stubbornness as the cause of radical Islamism or jihadism and causes the instability in the region. Brzezinski, for example, a very important advisor to Barack Obama, actually believed this and propagated this notion. Also with the problematic Polish heritage who went to McGill, but we won't get into that. When it comes to Israeli policies in existence, they believe that if the Jews would only change, that the problems in the region would be managed or dissipated. That the Jews, the Israeli stubbornness is causing the problems. So, in other words, it's the existence of Israel and the stubbornness of the Israelis for not making peace that is the cause of contemporary anti-Semitism, and it's the cause of jihadism. And if only Israel would disappear, or if the stubborn Israelis would change their policies, at the end of this sort of global problem would be resolved and world peace would break out if it were not just for the Jews. So, this is, in a sense, contemporary anti-Semitism. If you look at the work, and we're going to hear about the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamism for the next 2 weeks, Islamist, as I was saying, takes Nazi fascist ideology and incorporates it into the core element of their ideology. This is not a peripheral belief. This is not the rantings and ravings of the radical wing of Islamism. This is not the military wing or the extreme wing. This is a central, basic ideological component which is perpetuated and taught in mosques and at fine institutions like Oxford University, where Tariq Ramadan and others do it in a very sophisticated way. So from an Islamist perspective, for a Jew to be equal is impossible. Muslims have to be higher. So for a Jew to be equal under the law, to have self-determination in Israel is impossible. It's not kosher. Even if Israel, it's not a question of boundaries, because even if Israel ceded all of its land but kept Tel Aviv as a city-state, and in Tel Aviv, Jews and Muslims and Christians and women and gay people were all equal under one legal system, from an Islamist perspective, this would also not be acceptable. This would have to be also destroyed. So Jews have to be lower, and those of us who believe in democratic principles and the self-determination of peoples, the fact that this regime or this ideological worldview wants to be imposed on Jews is unacceptable. And what's happening is that many in the West perceive this to be an Israeli problem, Israeli stubbornness, and even sophisticated, well-educated Jews in the United States and in parts of Europe who were more sophisticated than our poor Israeli cousins, brothers, believed also in the halls of Oxbridge and in the halls of the media record. If you wanted to have a good job, you had to prove that you were a good, reasonable Jew, and that you don't subscribe to these Zionist Israeli policies, that you are more cultured. So to get ahead, to have achievement in our institutions, you had to toe a certain line and not be perceived as a primitive Zionist Jew or a Jew connected to his or her homeland. So it was a problem of the Israelis, and if the Israelis would change and make peace, everything would be fine. But when we look at the ideology of radical political Islam and its Nazi origins, or the incorporation of Nazism, if you look at the Hamas Charter, if you look at the founding fathers of Islamist thought, you see the direct, open, clear, and I think at one level you have to respect the honesty and the clarity of this movement, because unlike sophisticated liberals in the West, who know the language, know how to speak, Kawadari, Ramadan, all these people speak very clearly when it comes to the Jewish question. They're open, they're honest, and they're consistent, particularly in Arabic and in Persian or Farsi. Very clear. And we have to respect the clarity. So they believe, if you look at the covenant of Hamas, and if you look at the writings, they incorporate the protocols of the elders of Zion. The protocols of the elders of Zion were the words and ideas that ultimately justified the extermination of Jews during the Holocaust, the removal from society, the systematic removal from society, and the final solution of the Jews. And yesterday we commemorate that more than 14,000 Jews in Paris were sent to Auschwitz, the place where democracy was born. And that this anti-Semitism is central. If you look at the Hamas covenant, you can see if the people who wrote the Hamas covenant took one of my courses at university, I would kick them out of my class for plagiarism, because they literally took from the protocols of the elders of Zion, they cut and pasted it and put it into their covenant, into their charter. So you can see that the Jews are responsible for all the ills of the world, that they brought communism and capitalism and democracy to the Islamic world, and they have to be eradicated, that they are the cause of all disease. There's the belief that Jews emanate from the urine of donkeys and pigs. Imagine. That this is a belief that is being taught at the finest institutions in the Western world in a more sophisticated manner, in sort of this postmodern manner, but it's being taught nonetheless. That human beings are the cause of all the ills in the world, all the diseases, and they emanate from the urine of donkeys and pigs. And we know from the teachings last night, we know from the laws of Noah, from the teachings of Emmanuel Levinas, that when you perceive human beings in this manner, that it justifies all sorts of horrific and evil behavior. And this is accepted. And for 2 pieces of silver, our finest institutions are aiding and abetting. So, for 2 generations or more, on the one hand, we have the influence of Islamist thinking and the connection, sort of this, some of us are writing about it and calling it the Red-Green Alliance. So radical political Islam with the left, the European progressive left, and the intellectuals, particularly the intellectuals in the West. So there's this Red-Green Alliance. And the demonization of the State of Israel is a part of not only Islamist thinking, but it's very much front and center and a part of mainstream social sciences. It started in Middle East studies, but is now sort of permeated all disciplines of the academy, in the social sciences and in the humanities. The demonization of Israel. And we see that I was going to say earlier, that the demonization of Israel is not just an Israeli problem. Because Jewish communities in the diaspora who identify with Israel, and we all do in varying forms, although there's interesting things happening in the United States with assimilation and politics, but that's an interesting phenomenon that maybe Barry can speak to, perhaps, or others. But Jews identify with Israel at a cultural level, at a religious level, at a historical level, in a very profound and deep way. Those of us who pray refer to Jerusalem many times a day. It's a part of our history, culture, family ties. It's a deep part of Jewish identities throughout the world. So now, if Israel from a left or a critical, progressive, intellectual, well-educated perspective is a Nazi apartheid racist state, as is the charge by people like Edward Said and Michel Foucault and great scholars in the academy. From a progressive perspective, from a human rights perspective, as a former part of the African National Congress Solidarity Committee of Canada and the United Kingdom, if Israel is an apartheid racist Nazi state, from a liberal perspective, from a human rights perspective, we would all be obligated to dismantle it. Because we can't permit a racist, fascist Nazi state to exist from a liberal human rights perspective. So the demonization of Jewish peoplehood, the demonization of the State of Israel, has gotten to the point, if this portrayal of Israel is true, liberal, educated people need to engage in dismantling this pariah state. At the same time, Jewish communities throughout Europe and increasingly in North America, and particularly students who identify with this Nazi apartheid fascist state, are seen as problematic. If you go to a university in a liberal kind of postmodern space, and students are going to Jewish organizations or espouse support or connections to Israel, they are a problem if it's an apartheid Nazi fascist state. If you go to synagogues in Europe and you want to pray, if you go to Jewish organizations, communities are now increasingly under siege by, it's politically incorrect to say, but it's true, by immigrants from Muslim countries, because the state of Israel is a problem. Generations, 100 years of 4 or 5 generations have been reared on these Nazi perceptions of Jews and of Israel. And the postmodern acquiescence to this reactionary social movement is enabling, or has enabled, a sharp increase in anti-Semitism against Jews in the diaspora. So Jewish communities, their space, or their place in Western European societies and in North America, the United States and Canada, and in South America, is becoming less comfortable, shall we say. And we'll see on Monday when we visit London the extent to which the Jewish community of London needs to go to protect itself. And I assure you that this will be an interesting experience when we go to the Community Security Trust. It's astounding what the community needs to do to defend itself. So things are shifting. The Jews are migrating from Europe to Israel and to other countries. So the demonization of Jewish peoplehood is having an impact on Jewish citizenship in Europe and North America. So, the contemporary canon, or the critique of the traditional Western Canada, for example, by people, important scholars like Michel, Foucault, and Edward Said, have also played a role, and this is very important to explore, I think, to demonize Jewish culture and its historical narrative in relation to Israel, its homeland, and beyond. This perspective is now an integral component of many universities and curriculums throughout the West. Michel Foucault, for example, welcomed the Iranian Revolution in 1979 as a triumph of spiritual values over the profanity of Western capitalist materialism. He perceived the Islamist revolution as a critique of Western culture and a protest against the political rationality of modernity. This sympathetic view of the Islamist revolution has been largely ignored, but it undoubtedly influenced the subsequent political philosophy and discourse of scholarship and the contributions of Foucault, and also of others. Edward Said, who was in Paris in the late 1970s during the time of the exiled leaders of the revolution of Iran who were living in France, fondly recalls spending time with Foucault and other revolutionaries in exile, and noted that they had both hoped that the Iranian Revolution would develop into what the French Revolution was to Kant 200 years ago. Despite its violence, they hoped that the revolution would be a crucial step toward the progressive emancipation for the people of Iran and the oppressed peoples of other nations in the region. Their critique of modernity and Western colonial power, combined with their lack of an ethical alternative, prevented these early postmodernists from criticizing the excesses of the Iranian Revolution and its failure to recognize the other as an equal and respected member of society. The works of Foucault and Said, as just an example, have thus helped to lay the foundation for the failure of many contemporary intellectuals to condemn the rise of political Islam as a social movement, especially in relation to its lack of the acceptance of basic notions of otherness within Islamic society, a cornerstone to the basic democratic principles or humane principles of a society, and turned a blind eye to its vitriolical prejudice against the Jewish people and Israel. This intellectual development should also be considered in the context of global politics and the prevailing environment in many academic institutions where the need for funding unfortunately appears to be having a growing impact on curriculum. Furthermore, Said's attempt to undermine the legitimacy of Jewish self-determination in Israel and the Jewish historical narrative in the diaspora needs to be critically examined with regard to the role of the reemergence of anti-Semitism among intellectuals and within the academy. Such a critique of the critique is especially urgent at this time, as there seems to be little possibility to address anti-Semitism forcefully within the academy, or to express outrage and concern regarding the recent successes of Islamism, despite its reactionary agenda and worldview. Instead, these ideological and philosophical foundations enable leading and respected scholars such as Judith Butler, and the list can go on and on, to argue, incredibly, to argue that Hamas and Hezbollah ought to be viewed as part of the progressive global left. It also encourages some observers, including scholars of anti-Semitism, to blame Israel for anti-Semitism throughout the world. So in other words, blaming the victim. In the aftermath, so I just want to say that the profound contradiction, the profound hypocrisy, we can see this in the queer march in Chicago a couple of weeks ago. The fact that Hamas adopted or supports now the BDS from 2 weeks ago. That feminists, that progressive thinkers, anti-racists, that critical scholars actually are aiding and abetting, supporting the sort of the reactionary forces in the Middle East. So on the one hand, citizens of the United Kingdom, of France, of Canada, of the United States of America, all the rights of these citizens should be not only protected but expanded. The rights of women, the rights of minorities, the rights of gay people. This is what democracy is all about. And yet, at the same time, leading intellectuals and scholars will actually say, and many, not just Judith Butler, that that Hamas and Hezbollah, Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, are part of a progressive movement, which calls for the killing of gay people, calls for women to be subjugated. So in other words, in these societies, a woman is not permitted to go outside of their home unaccompanied by a male adult member of their family. And yet feminists in the West are calling for the support of these reactionary ideals, particularly and especially when it comes to the Jews. And this, in my view, is anti-Semitism at the highest level, because this is the sort of intellectual and philosophical moment that we find ourselves in. So once again, the demonization of the most important contemporary form or element of Jewish identity. And we know from professors like Ruth Weiss and others that anti-Semitism and the scapegoating of Jews is effective. So this is what the Nazis did. The Nazis said, look at the Jew, look at the shtetl Jew, look at the banking Jew, look at how the Jews are unfair in practice, look at their business practices. They stick together, they infiltrate society. Look at the Jew, look at the Jew. But over here, while everybody's looking at the Jew like the puppeteer, the Nazis and the fascists were running rampant and taking over society, taking over institutions of power, taking over universities. The universities, by the way, the only institution during the Nazi regime in which there was no force needed or required to take over the institutions. The professors aided and abetted the Nazis to kick the Jews out and to take the spaces of the Jews. Even the police in Nazi Germany and the military showed some resistance to the Nazis, but the universities, the only institution that willfully aided and abetted without any violence. So here we have this moment where we focus on the apartheid, racist, fascist, Nazi, Zionist entity, And over here, we have an ongoing genocide. We have states collapsing. We have the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists buying spaces in universities as a concerted effort to have impact on the cultural and democratic institutions of Western societies, given a free hand to pursue its agenda and educate the next generations of young scholars, of journalists, of thinkers, of political leaders. And we get to the point where there is this sort of global crisis, and everybody's focused on Israel, Netanyahu, Likud, and what is happening to our Muslim brothers and sisters in many parts of the world. We remain silent, and to be progressive, we must remain silent on these situations. Because then we'll be siding with the Zionists and the Jews if we start to get into this situation. I'll just say that I did an article with Edward Kaplan, I think it's in the reading list. We interviewed 5,000 people across Europe, and we asked them a series of questions about traditional forms of anti-Semitism, and we used the term Israelbashing. So we asked a series of questions about classical forms of anti-Semitism, and then questions about Israel, that we had a statement to agree that Israel is an apartheid state. The IDF intentionally murders children. Israelis are poisoning the water of Palestinian water supplies and wells. So very extreme questions. And we found that a small group of people in 10 European countries were anti-Semitic, and a small group of people, even a smaller group of people, were Israel bashers in our criteria. But what we also found, which is staggering, that those who are Israel bashers are 13 times more likely to be anti-Semitic in the classical sense. So the correlation is very strong. It's off the charts, in a sense. So if, for example, you would go to the drugstore or pharmacy and, I don't know, coffee, a brand of coffee was 13 times more likely to cause cancer than other brands of coffee, you can be assured that the brand would be removed from the shelves, and there would be probably an inquiry about what happened, how did the coffee get to the shelves. So this correlation is very strong. So the connection between anti-Semitism and Israel bashing is strong and clear scientifically. And I'll just say a short story. I worked on this article, and it was published in a Journal of Conflict Resolution, and somehow, when you're at Yale, you get sometimes media attention. So the article was written about in the New York Times, and the Guardian, and Le Monde. It got a buzz. And my parents, going back to our family, my mother was a very intelligent woman, got married at 17 years old, had me when she was 19, didn't finish high school, but a very intelligent woman. And I came home from New Haven to have Shabbat dinner with my parents. My parents have big Shabbat dinners, and there were probably about 20 people there, which is common for them. And near the end of dinner, my mother was at the end of the table, told everybody to be quiet, and she said, Charles, I read the article. It was very empirical based with a lot of mathematical formulas. I said, I tried to read it, but it was very confusing. It was hard to understand. Could you explain it? I just basically explained what I just explained to you. So my mother listened, and then she said, how long did you work on this project for? So I said, about 9 or 10 months. So my mother thought for a few seconds, and she turned to the 20 people around the table, and she said, you see, my son, the professor, he took 10 months to prove what everybody at this table already knows. But it keeps you humble. But so there's truth to it. So there's an alarm and a great concern in the Jewish community. Elie Wiesel said famously in 2003 that this is a time of great urgency, the rise of anti-Semitism. He was never so concerned in 2003 with the rise of anti-Semitism since the Holocaust. And then he went on to correct himself. And he said, no, this is not a time of great urgency. This is a time of an emergency. And things have, unfortunately, since he said this in 2003, have become more alarming in 2017. But the point also is that it's important to prove this at a scholarly level, and I think thanks to this article and other articles and other research that has been done on the correlation between anti-Semitism and bashing Israel, and of course, arguing with Israel, arguing or researching or discussing the contradictions in Israeli society, and there are many, or the policies of the Israeli government and the shortcomings of the mistakes that the Israeli government has made, makes, and will make, is healthy to democracy. It's wonderful. Every group of scholars should critique and understand and try to improve their societies, and certainly in democratic societies we can do it much easier than in other places where we don't have the freedom to do it. But the point is that you can criticize Israel, but the correlation that has now been proven in a body of research over the last decade shows that there is a strong correlation about demonizing and delegitimizing Israel and anti-Semitism. And the fact is, in the last few years, thanks to this research, there was the London Declaration in the British Parliament and the Ottawa Protocol in the Canadian Parliament, in which 68 countries from around the world came together and actually have begun to endorse the definition of contemporary anti-Semitism, of not only to include the religious bigotry and the racist element of anti-Semitism, but to also begin to understand that the demonization of Jewish peoplehood and the delegitimization of the right of Israel and the Jewish people to have self-determination in their homeland is also a form of anti-Semitism. The British government, the Canadian government, recently the European Union have passed resolutions that recognize that the demonization and the delegitimization of Israel is a form of anti-Semitism. So legislation is beginning to be affected by the research that our colleagues do in this area, and it's very important. I'll just end, and then we can have a few questions. We're going till 12:30. Yeah. 12:30, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, 12:30.
So I came from this human rights background. I lived in Israel. I lived in Israel at various points in my life, and I was there in the 1990s at the height of the hope for a two-state solution. And coming from my human rights background, when I was teaching, I taught at Ben Gurion University in the Negev, my first year in Israel. And I joined a group of scholars, of Israeli scholars and Palestinian scholars, in trying to promote understanding and dialogue and peace. And we would meet for dinners, informal dinners at people's homes, and they were wonderful. And we were a group of about 20 to 30 people, and we would meet for these dinners. And we had these exchanges, which were very important, and were sort of contributing to this moment of hope of peace. And I met this very nice guy. I won't say his name. He came from Ramallah, from Palestinian Authority. And he was a very cultured intellectual, professor, from a big family of scholars that go back, important family in Palestinian society. And he would say the most outlandish things to me, and we would argue. We had one discussion, I remember, about civil rights and Martin Luther King, and he was saying things about democracy, which I ended up sort of getting really upset with him. And we had these arguments. We had about 3 or 4 arguments, and I couldn't believe what he was saying about women and about Jews. I couldn't believe it. We had these arguments. So around the 4th or 5th time, instead of arguing, I said to him, and he was a very nice guy. I thought, despite his ideas, he was nice and very warm. And we had a dinner at his house, and he was very hospitable and respectful. But he had these ideas that were mind-blowing. So around the 4th or 5th time, I asked him, can you please recommend some readings, because where are you coming from? I just didn't understand where he was coming from. And I was fortunate to go to McGill and the University of London and Oxford, so I come with this education in social theory and politics. And when you're educated in this field, you probably, in a very short period of time, you can figure out if somebody is liberal or conservative, if they're religious or secular, if they're postmodern or modernist, if they're a functionalist. We get to categorize people. Right? We're schooled in categorizing. so he started to give me these books. So I went to these great schools. I had no idea, I never heard of the people that he recommended. And this was my introduction into the Muslim Brotherhood and into the thinkers and the philosophy of political Islam. And it sort of blew my mind, because I couldn't believe what I was reading. And I couldn't believe that I had no understanding or awareness of it with my good education. Somehow I missed it, and I suspect many of us in our education also missed it. And this is a very important worldview. And as my mentor, Shengi Raghavan, who's part of the Black Consciousness movement, when he sent me to Oxford, he said, remember, I'm sending you to Oxford to study the mind of your enemy. And that was my mission. And I think in a sense what we have to do is also study the mind of our enemies when it comes to political Islam. And many of us, and many of the students, and many of our colleagues in this sort of postmodern moment, we sort of impose our wishes on reality. You know, there should be peace. It's a cycle of violence. It's the Israelis are a bit stubborn. They did bad things, and if they would stop and treat the Palestinians better, everything will be okay. But we don't, and that would be beautiful, by the way, if it worked out like that one day, you know, God willing. But at the same time, we have to respect the other. We have to take this philosophical and political movement seriously, because political Islam is not the rantings and ravings of a bunch of stupid people or uneducated people. Because the founding intellectuals of this movement are serious. They have a deep philosophical worldview, they have a deep religious worldview, they have a very specific and clear set agenda for transforming society. They have a military approach. They know when to take a step forward and take 3 steps back and go 4 steps forward. They have strategy. And it's a very serious, comprehensive worldview. And we in the West are so ignorant and arrogant because we think we don't need to engage this worldview to understand it and to advise solutions for it, for the region into the future. We don't even have to know what our enemies or our colleagues are thinking because we can impose a reality on it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a huge mistake. And I think what we need to do as a group of scholars concerned about contemporary anti-Semitism is become fluent in the ideology, in the teachings of political Islam. We have to know the mind of our opponent in order to understand the problems, and by understanding the problems, hopefully down the road, discussing and developing solutions. But if we don't understand the problem, if we don't understand the ideology and the ideas that we're up against, it's futile to do anything. And what often happens in liberalism, I remember it's Ryan's book of Blaming the Victim. In racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, we often look to the victim as the cause of the problem. So we spoke about how, in the racist discourse, African American men are aggressive, but they're also lazy. Jews assimilate, but they stick together. Right? The Israelis are apartheid fascists, but they're a democracy. We have all these contradictions that the Israelis and the Jews are causing anti-Semitism, and if they would only change, the solution would come about. But that is just blaming the victim. We used to do this when women were also abused in society. The judges would ask them why were they there, what were they doing, what were they saying, what were they wearing, right? We look to the victim as the source of understanding the crimes. And I think what we need to do in a society is understand the ideology that we're dealing with and to study deeply what is transpiring and what are enemies. And they're enemies of democracy. I say, to say things in black and white is a sin, I know, in this postmodern moment, but it is. This is an enemy of democracy. This is a movement that its clear objective is to destroy democratic principles and institutions, to destroy the notions of citizenship and equality under the law. So this is an enemy not just to the Jews and to the Israelis, but I would submit to you that the Israelis and the Jews are on the front line of this struggle. And they understand the struggle very well. And even though Israeli scholarship is written off by many departments of Middle East studies and Western institutions as being problematic, I would submit to you that the ideas and the discourse and discussion that are taking place in Israeli universities today are of paramount importance to the future of Western democracies throughout the world, because they're on the front line. They deal with this problem on their borders and even internally in a way of policing and security, but also intellectually and in terms of policy. There's a deep understanding of the other in Israeli society because they're up against it in daily life, the positive sides of that society and the problems of that society. So that understanding needs to be heard. I'd also submit to you that anti-Semitism studies is also historically problematic. That the study of anti-Semitism is usually done by historians who are well versed in European society and European languages, which is important and should not be negated. But it's important to understand the contemporary context. And I think at the same time, those of us who do security studies or counterterrorism studies in the West and in Israel are very well familiar with the intricacies of Middle East societies, of Middle East processes, language, culture, religion, and yet they pay little attention to the issues of anti-Semitism. So I think there has to be a coming together of those of us who understand the history of anti-Semitism and those of us who understand the contemporary context, and to listen to each other and educate each other about A, the importance of anti-Semitism, and B, the importance of what's transforming and the impact of this transformation in the Middle East. So there's a need to transform our area of study, to incorporate more elements of the study of anti-Semitism in the contemporary context. So I think I will end it here, and we have about 20 minutes for questions, comments, or discussion.
Great. I'd like to kick it off, Charles, because one of the advantages of having been here over the past 3 years is that I get to see the different iterations and growths and dialogues that expand as a result of Charles' speaking and other standard speakers at ISGAP returning to some of the same problems but in new contexts. So Charles, I want to thank you very much for providing me with new ways to hear how your paper dialogue is the current situation. I guess I'd ask you just to address for a moment. I was very interested in your addressing the stereotype. If you could hit on inversion for a minute as well, in terms of how stereotypes are used, right? I mean, for instance, my wife's family comes from the Caribbean, and my family on both sides come, of course, from Africa, but most recently, as in over the last 250 years, from the United States. And so my Caribbean family and friends often tell me, they say, Carlton, if I were in your position and I was encountering racism and white hegemony in the United States, I would have the biggest mouth, because I would be saying things like, I built this country. Why would you say that we're lazy? It was our labor that was being used. And that my sense of Americanness is so profound because of the fact that I actually can go back over 200 years on both sides of the family tree to see folks who were in the U.S. building it with their labor through their forced labor. And it's so curious how that forced labor gets reified, gets redefined, gets reimagined, gets assaulted, gets perverted, and sold back to you, saying, oh, by the way, you didn't work at all. Meanwhile, you know, what could be lazier than stealing human beings and forcing them to work for you, right? But so I just, as you engage this, I just love to hear your comment on inversion, especially as it relates to the Jewish situation.
Yes, that's an important point, and yeah, I agree profoundly with that notion that you just said. So I think when it comes to anti-Semitism, contemporary anti-Semitism, the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, is actually using the imagery of Jewish suffering to turn it back on the Jews. So Roger Waters, for example, who has the Pink Floyd musician, who's the most successful musician, solo musician ever. He's doing a tour of North America now as we speak. He actually said yesterday that Israel is like Nazi Germany. And this sort of inversion that the Israelis are Nazis, that the Israelis are a racist society is very painful because it's taking Jewish history of the Holocaust, of being the victim of brutal hatred that resulted in the marginalization and the extermination of many, many people, and turning it on them. So in a way, it's almost like murdering the Jews twice. You murder them once, and then you murder their history. And yeah, so it's a very powerful issue. And Roger Waters, as an example, in his art, he dresses up in the Nazi uniform during his concert and reenacts elements of what happened in World War II. And off stage, he's arguing for a boycott of Israel, which is sort of legitimate in the sort of intellectual moment in which the media and the universities have been influenced by these ideas. So it's disturbing, to say the least. And I wonder, and then Ian Halpern and I we're doing a film project, and we say, and I said this in an interview, so a man dresses up as a Nazi on stage in his art, which in the United States of America, First Amendment, okay. This sort of white European guy is dressing up as a Nazi. And in his concerts, there's pigs floating with dollar signs and Jewish stars in the concert. It's a very high-tech extravaganza show, which is his right to do. But off stage, he's calling for a boycott of Jews exactly like the Nazis did. Right? And my question is, can you imagine if a white American entertainer or musician in his art got on stage, got dressed up in a white sheet and burnt a cross? It'd probably be disturbing. It'd be disturbing. But maybe with the First Amendment and artistic freedom in the United States, maybe, civil libertarians of all backgrounds would say it's repugnant, but this artist has the right to do his art. But if the guy gets off stage and calls for the re-enslavement of African Americans, I think there'd be chaos, and rightfully so. But when it comes to this issue, there's silence. In the United States of America today, there's silence of a guy dressing up as a Nazi on stage, having anti-Semitic imagery. He's at the forefront of the boycott movement, and in real life calling for a boycott of Jewish establishments and of Israel. And there's silence. So this sort of, the miseducation and the uneducation of intellectuals on contemporary anti-Semitism is staggering. And I hope I'm right. And I think if it came to an artist doing something like this about racism, against African Americans, or a grotesque expression of sexism and homophobia, there'd be an outcry. And yet, Roger Waters is filling stadiums tonight with 60,000 people across America, and this is not even a blip on the screen. And I think this shows the work that needs to be done, because I don't think for about 2 generations in universities, there's been some progress. There needs to be more, but there's been some progress on issues of race and gender. I would argue maybe people don't agree, which is right. You're right. We can talk about it.
Yeah.
But it's part of the curriculum. It's part of our education. And it's not when it comes to this issue.
Yeah, and the footnote on the sexism pieces, I think there's a really great piece years ago someone did. They took a transcript from a woman's rape trial, and they substituted a guy's Rolex watch with regard to her physical assault. And so weird things came out, such as like, how many, people have you shared your Rolex with, or were you drunk, or why were you wearing your Rolex, in public? There's lots of really interesting kind of dialogues that emerge from which point to the absurdity of some of the presuppositions that are infused in these conversations.
Does anybody have any questions?
No more from me.
Why do you think there are outcries of these incidents that you sort of describe would take place? Why do you think there are outcries for, say, the homosexual or the racist imagery, or maybe for blacks? Because I could argue that there are not outcries really there either. That there are public attention, but not outcries. But yet, use your terminology, outcries. Why do you think there are outcries?
Why there are or are not?
Are. You say that there, if the guy stood up and put a white sheet on, that there would be an outcry, or if somebody did something similar to a homosexual, would be an outcry. Why do you think there are outcries?
I think there are outcries, in my perception, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, that I think that if a major celebrity that was entertaining millions of people in the United States engaged in overt racism, calling for the re-enslavement of African Americans, that I don't know exactly how the establishment would address it, or maybe the mainstream media would address it, but I would assume that the African American community would mobilize to a significant degree, that they would protest, organize a boycott, even marches, that they would react. And there's civil rights leaders who, for better or for worse, have made a career of it perhaps. There's churches, I believe that the community would react to some extent. Maybe they should react stronger than they would, but there would be a reaction. And I find that even in the Jewish community, we are like deer in the headlights, because we don't even understand what contemporary anti-Semitism is. And I think because of the education, maybe because of the fact that the civil rights movement happened not too long ago, that there is sort of a consciousness of what is racism, at least within the community to an extent, or among leaders in the community and part of the constituents of the community. I think the Jewish community is faced with a dilemma, particularly in the United States, where I think it's even more difficult, where the community doesn't know how to respond. They don't know exactly what anti-Semitism is. They don't know what it's being fueled by. They know their children on campus are, as Barry will speak to, are disproportionately targeted on American university campuses more than any other group. They experience anti-Semitism in a very significant way. It was denied in the community for a long time. I would argue in the last few years it's now a concern. I think scholars like us, Larry can testify to this, I think in the Upper West Side of New York, in the comfortable middle-class Jewish communities, among professionals in the American Jewish world, that there was a reluctance to even acknowledge that there was a problem, because the bubble was going to be burst. And now it's gone to a point where parents and grandparents are hearing their children come home from university and they realize this is a serious issue. And how do we as a community assert ourselves? Maybe Israel is an apartheid state. Maybe Israel's maybe not an apartheid state, but they're not so nice and they're not doing good things, and we're not like them. And there's a distancing from Jewish identity that's also accelerating. So there's a real cleavage in the Jewish community, or a division in the Jewish community, for all sorts of reasons. It's a acculturation that's been going on for generations. I think to a large extent the crisis over the Iran nuclear weapons program really polarized the Jewish community, and I would argue and I would submit to you that it was done by some very effectively and with intent to sort of take a part of the community, divide the community, and take a part of it close to the enemies, if you will, of Israel. I think the inability of the Jewish community to be unified, even on the Iran nuclear weapons issue in the United States of America, points to a divided, confused community. And a reluctance to deal with contemporary anti-Semitism. It makes people feel very uncomfortable. especially, I would argue, when they have some success. And, I can tell you many antidotes, but I think that there's levels of assimilation, acculturation, a distancing from Jewish identity, a distancing from Israel because it causes people to feel discomfort in the United States of America, and an unwillingness to address the issues, an unwillingness to address the fact that the United States of America, over the last 18 months, or the Obama administration, gave $150 billion of aid to the Iranian revolutionary regime that is expressly inciting to genocidal, to genocide. The Trump administration just gave $350 billion in military aid to Saudi Arabia that equally has this sort of genocidal view of Jews and of the world. So $500 billion in military aid and economic aid given to regimes that openly and inherently call for the extermination of people, and the silence of the community. And being involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, I think that if some president stood up and gave, at the height of the struggle, at the height of when the regime was being isolated, and the boycott movement was gaining strength, and there was a movement, and negotiations were starting, and there was talk of Mandela coming out of prison, and things were moving. If the President of the United States gave $150 billion at that point to the apartheid regime, I think there would be a reaction, a strong reaction. And yet, in the United States, in the Jewish community, there was confusion. So what are these processes? What are we up against? The fact that Siemens and Boeing just made a fortune from deals in Iran and with Saudi Arabia. There's power politics, there's power relations that we need as scholars to unpack. And if we can understand these processes effectively as intellectuals and scholars, inform human rights communities, inform policymakers, inform our community of what these processes of power relations are doing to the issues of marginalization, of anti-Semitism, of aiding and abetting reactionary forces that are engaged in genocide of their fellow citizens today, and are having, invited to elite institutions in the West as honored colleagues. So what is going on? I think the task of intellectuals is great, and as Elie Wiesel said, and tragically, he was right, I believe. We're living in a time of an emergency, and the role of the intellectual is really, really important to unpacking these difficult times. So I hope I respond.
First of all, thank you very much for your amazing talk. It was talking to the deep level of topics I was personally thinking about. And I just want to follow up your last note about the role of intellectuals. In your talk, you mentioned how the Islamic studies started in the most prestigious universities and kind of created this branding that was resulted in social acceptance of the contemporary anti-Semitism. And I was wondering, maybe the solution, or part of the solution to target this issue would be getting funding and more initiatives on Jewish studies, on Israel studies, projects like the Schusterman Center and so on. Maybe in the long term it can create this change in the minds of intellectual society that goes to the society itself.
Yeah, I think research and high caliber research is very important. So there's a fellowship program by the Schusterman Foundation. It's important. But even in the Schusterman Foundation, there's a reluctance to deal with certain issues. So I think we have to break these taboos of studying contemporary anti-Semitism even within Jewish institutions. That's number one. And number two, I think that this is an issue of those of us who care about social democracy and human rights, and to work with people from the region that are being most affected, and to map and decode what is happening in terms of our education, who's funding our education, who's funding the universities, and to map out the power dynamics affected by how these dynamics are affecting our education. it's a multi-layered approach. We have to do research, but also understand the context in which we're at. Thank you. Anybody else for a comment or question?
Just a thought, I think, what are your thoughts about this? I think one of the perceptions, one of the resistances I run into when I raise the question about antisemitism is people saying, what are you talking about? Jesus doing fantastically well. You know, they have powerful Israeli army, Israel is successful financially, the American Jews are doing well. There are so many people who are struggling. Larry, why are you spending your effort on anti-Semitism? Jews are doing great compared to so many others. I wonder how you
Who says this?
understand this.
Who says this?
This is the generic Upper West Side intellectual.
Can I just say that I echo this point when I was convening this Israel Studies Center in India. I faced a lot of backlash from my colleagues saying that Jews are doing very well, why would they even bother? And why bother about Israel? Because they're, again, the usual concept of Zionism is colonialism and all of that came out. So this is, I would like to also hear what you're talking about.
So I think the study of anti-Semitism, so, you know, we say, those of us who study this subject, I'm sure you've heard this, that anti-Semitism begins with Jews and never ends with Jews. So I don't think it's necessarily a Jewish problem. Morally and ethically and intellectually, I would argue that it's actually not a Jewish problem. The problem is those who hate. That's number one. So Jews and Israelis are maybe the victim of it or are the target of it. So there should be an understanding. So I think scholars and intellectuals should deal with it. Given the pedigree of anti-Semitism and the role it played in Europe, Enlightenment, Western civilization and thought, I think anybody who wants to understand Western civilization, the role of the other, the perception of the other, whatever the other is, I think this area of inquiry is crucial. That's not to say it's more important than studying racism or other forms of discrimination, not at all. But if you want to understand the rise of Western thought, before the West went out into the world to conquer, to colonize, the Jews were here. And the perceptions of the Jews and the perception of the Jew has a long pedigree, which affects and is associated with the perception of others, right, by the West. Hegel's ladder of consciousness, we can go on for all. So it's an important part of Western thought. So I think anybody who says to you, why are you wasting your time, I don't think has a deep understanding of the importance of thought, of philosophy and social theory and history. Let me, yeah. But in terms of understanding, there's a social movement that is growing in power. I think it's growing in power because of globalization and neoliberalism, etc., as I was arguing. It's affecting more and more societies. It's affecting the lives of Jews. The Israelis are defending themselves against it, spending a lot of time, energy, and effort defending itself and trying to understand it. Europe is now beginning to realize that the problem in this globalized world is not going to be just limited to a certain region, but it's now affecting our policies, in our security policies, our integration policies, our political approaches. It's affecting our elections. We have the rise of Le Pen, we have the rise of UKIP here, and nationalism in Hungary and Greece. There's a reaction to stuff that's happening in terms of globalization and anti-Semitism. So it's a part of this whole process. And we have now, Jews are leaving certain parts of Europe. Jews are being attacked. The level you'll see on Monday, but the extent to which Jews in Europe, particularly France and England, Great Britain, have to deal with this issue at a material, physical level. And anybody in the Upper West Side who says to you, the Jews are all doing well, why are you wasting your time, I have to say are ignorant of these issues. And that, as Elie Wiesel said, anti-Semitism begins with Jews. Here we have a genocidal, reactionary social movement that is using Nazi ideology as its core, that took over Egypt for a while and created havoc. It is unleashed in many parts of the Middle East. I keep going back to the genocide in Syria and Iraq. is being unleashed there. A friend that I grew up in Montreal with, who was a Muslim family that lived in my neighborhood. The father came from Hyderabad, came to Canada, created a mosque in Montreal. He was an enlightened, amazing person, a friend of my family. I grew up with the kids, they were my friends, went to the same schools. He was kicked out of the mosque 15 years ago in Montreal that he created because he wouldn't grow a beard and he insisted on maintaining his friendship with Jews. This is in Montreal. Okay, so here was a man who started a mosque, who was an observant, nice Muslim, good to his neighbors, good friend of the family, and he can't go to pray in the house of worship that he created with his friends because he wanted to maintain his friendship with Jews. So something is happening globally, even in New York, even in Montreal, even in Los Angeles, and certainly in Europe and certainly in the Middle East. Turkey is going through this revolution in which tens of thousands of people have been incarcerated, hundreds of thousands of people have lost their jobs, and for political reasons, we don't even really hear about this so much in the media because this is okay. But if Netanyahu advocates building a bathroom in some city in the region, it becomes a major issue. Why? And I think this is in part anti-Semitism. And I also think that in the Upper West Side, among intellectuals that you associate yourself, there's a fear. We had at Columbia University, we did a lecture with Haris Rafiq, who will be speaking here, and he looked at anti-Semitism in Islam. That was a variation of the title. And two tenured, older professors at Columbia made us change the title. They were Jewish tenured professors, made us change the title. Didn't want to publicize it too much because they were terrified that there was going to be a riot at Columbia University and they were going to be attacked. So here, two Jewish guys in their 60s, tenured professors at Columbia University in New York City, the most Jewish city in the diaspora, right? Terrified because they didn't want to be attacked physically or ostracized from their faculty colleagues for doing something that would be politically incorrect. Haris Rafiq, who's a practicing proud Muslim fighting radical Islam, was appalled because he wants at least the Jewish community to take a strong position on Islamism, which is destroying his community, destroying his family, and destroying his society. And yet, in the comfort of America, the most free country, the best for the Jews, as your friends would say, there was fear. And then also, I think we really have to unpack the discourse that has affected several administrations, the last administration for certain, and this administration as well, of the discourse of anti-Semitic discourse, the denial of the issue, the obfuscation of the issue. Some of the political ads that went on with Trump, some of the politics that went under the previous administration. So aiding and abetting the Muslim Brotherhood, aiding and abetting the Muslim Brotherhood, and there was silence. And then aiding and abetting Sunni extremists, and then giving a deal to the Shiite extremists. And these are movements that literally use Nazi propaganda when it comes to Jews. And yet, as I say, denial ain't just the river in Egypt.
Because I get a lot, so I really appreciate that.
Thanks. All right, so we have to end here because food is more important than this stuff. So have a nice lunch.